riding it out with us through our technical difficulties. We're joined here this morning by Logan, but welcome everyone to the Newly podcast, where you get practical, no BS insights on how to grow yourself and grow your career. On this episode, we have my friend Logan Lyles. He is the head of partnerships and evangelism and also content marketing at Teamwork. Welcome, Logan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Sorry, everybody, we're starting a little bit late, but I appreciate the invite and excited to share my journey. It's been a meandering one, so hopefully there's something to learn from it.
Absolutely. I know I've learned a lot from you already. So why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I just made a recent move into the marketing org at teamwork.com. I graduated college in 2008 with a journalism degree, and I always say that was a great time to hit the job market for any fellow millennials who graduated around that time. It's just like, oh my gosh. And I graduated with a journalism degree, as I said, nonetheless, and that industry was going through some major disruption, to say the least. Spent about 10 years in B2B sales locally, regionally, moved into the broader B2B world, serving SaaS companies through selling for an agency for about 4 years, moved into a partnerships role. And now I'm going through another transition from partnerships to evangelism. We can talk about how that ties together, but that's kind of the 4-step journey to sum it up as succinctly as I can. And then obviously we'll drill into the different pivot moments and shifting throughout that as we go today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And just such an interesting place to start in that you started with a journalism degree. So
Mhm.
our topic today is pivoting into sales to grow your career, or should you pivot into sales to grow your career? And I know this is a question that a lot of people ask themselves because usually, there's people talk about how sales can be quite lucrative. And I know I've heard
Mhm.
of teachers and other individuals who are in more difficult industries wanting to switch to sales.
Mhm.
So let's just start, talking a little bit about how you made that switch and why you made that switch. So what was the pivotal moment for you when you knew that you wanted to pivot your career out of journalism?
Yeah. I would say it came more from, hey, I think I have to, before it was, hey, I really want to go do this. And I
Okay.
think there are people probably watching and listening today that are contemplating a pivot out of either necessity or desire, or maybe a little bit of a mixture of both. And so I think mine was a mixture. As I mentioned, graduated college in 2008. I was a photojournalism major. And so really kind of the track was to go into print journalism. Video was just starting to become a thing, really, with local journalism. I was trained in shooting still photography, and I did my internship at a newspaper out here in Boulder, Colorado. And they were like, here's a video camera, capture some video too. And I was like, wait, what? And as I started applying to jobs, I realized, okay, these are really competitive. They're not very high paying. I was already married at that point, thinking about starting a family. I did all of those things sort of young. And so there was some financial motivation. There was also just the realities of the industry that I was seeing. And I got my first sales job actually selling copiers and printers in a small college town in Bozeman, Montana. And I remember the first few weeks and the first few months coming home and telling my wife, I just hate this. Like, I hate trying to talk people into something, trying to persuade people into something. And I almost gave up on it in those first 2 years. And I remember one of my mentors at the time saying, if you can make it through your first 2 years in sales, you can basically do anything after that, whether you want to continue on in sales or you want to, pivot down the line. And that felt like a long ways away. But one thing I did find was that, hey, I was selling some technology and I kind of nerd out on technology at times. Maybe I could leverage that. And what I do enjoy is teaching and conveying knowledge and sharing what I know. Let me kind of lean into that. So I kind of took it upon myself to kind of geek out, learn as much as I could about the products that we were selling, and take that approach of, hey, I'm going to share with you what I know, what I think is interesting. If you buy from me, great. If not, then that's okay. And I was actually surprised to find that that actually made me a better salesperson as opposed to trying to become the stereotypical salesperson that I had in my head from, Glengarry Glenn Ross, Wolf of Wall Street, or,
Yeah.
something like that. Pursuit of Happiness and Tommy Boy are actually two of my more favorite sales movies, but
Oh,
that's
yeah.
conversation for another time.
Well, I love those two movies, both fantastic movies. But what I think is so interesting about what you said is that if you can make it through the first 2 years of sales, that you can succeed anywhere. And I think that's, I've been in sales, in different parts of my career, and I think that's probably really true. It really is where you first to start to find your rhythm. You start to actually build a little bit of momentum, and sometimes, especially in
Mhm.
B2B sales, it takes time to build that momentum. So I just love that you pointed that out. So what has been compelling about pivoting your career to sales, and kind of what keeps you in the game, so to speak?
Mhm. Yeah, I would say for me, I hit about 10 years in selling in an industry that then, as I mentioned, I was selling copiers and printers, and there are probably people listening to this that are like, wait, those are still things? Like people use those in offices where we still go to the
Here.
office, especially post COVID, right? But, I was able to, I feel like I missed the heyday of that industry probably by about 10 or 15 years, especially when I heard kind of older sales reps say, what they used to make and how easy it used to be and that sort of stuff. But I found that I was able to translate that to my next stint in sales with a podcast production agency, Sweetfish. I think you've had Dan Sanchez on your show as well. He and I crossed paths there. And that was kind of the second time I pivoted in my career, and I kind of used this. You and I talked about it before, Britta, this idea of, I think it's from Steve Jobs, you can only connect the dots in the rearview mirror looking backwards sometimes. And I remember when I was interviewing for my first sales job right out of college, they were like, well, why do you think you would be good at this? I was like, well, and I tried to look at what I had done. So looking backwards and try to connect the dots to where I was and where I was trying to go just ahead, right? I couldn't really connect the dots that far out, but I said, hey, I've been in journalism. I have to go out and start conversations with people. Sometimes people aren't comfortable with journalists, just like they're not comfortable with salespeople. You've got to learn to break the ice. You got to learn to ask good questions. And I basically said, I think there are dots that could connect here.
Mhm.
And my first sales manager that hired me said that because I did that, plus I came in, I walked in the door, I tried to find who the person was. So it's kind of that journalistic training
Mhm.
came in, like you go find the person, you don't just send something out into the ether. And so that helped me transition there. And then as I looked at selling for the podcast agency Sweetfish, I remember talking with the founder James of like, hey, I've been selling something that is not super exciting, that is an industry that's somewhat declining. And at the time, the second wave of podcasting was really starting to rise. I'm like, if I can sell copiers and printers, I think I can sell podcasting services.
Yeah.
And so I also at that point said, hey, I've been starting to get active on LinkedIn. I've been starting to write there, leaning into some of my journalism experience. And James, who hired me there, was like, hey, would you be okay with stepping into this sales role and also creating content on LinkedIn? And so there again, I was like, well, I've already been leaning into that. I think my journalism background can tie into that as well and make me successful there. And so again, it was that theme of looking back and saying, not trying to force something or contrive a connection where there isn't one, but sometimes there are translatable skills or experiences that we have that might not be right there on the surface. So if you're trying to find, that next thing and you're like, oh, it says 3 years experience, exactly this, even though you might not have it on paper or the role, what are things in that role that you've done in a different context that you might be able to pitch realistically and say, I could translate this to this?
Yeah.
because that did work for me in a couple instances as I pivoted throughout my career.
Yeah, I think there's so many wonderful points to highlight here, but I think the main one that I wanted to highlight was the fact that you talked that they asked you, what makes you want to be a salesperson, and you connected the dots for them. I think there's oftentimes when we're pivoting into any career, we kind of we kind of hope that the people that are interviewing us see that. But really, it's our responsibility to convey that, to convey where those dots connect and how we can make those dots connect in this new career. And I just love that you, in multiple different shifts in your sales career, that you found ways to connect your knowledge, your experience to how that might apply to the job, and you did that actively. What would you say to someone who maybe is struggling to be able to connect dots for themselves?
Yeah. I heard this advice early in my career, always keep your resume up to date, right?
Mm,
Because it's tough to scramble and update your resume when you have to.
yeah,
And so I think that's good advice. But to make that even more practical, people are like, okay, all right, update my resume, keep it always up to date. What does that mean? One way you can do that that will actually help you with this mental exercise of connecting the dots is create a regular rhythm, could be weekly, could be monthly, and keep a journal, keep a Notion page, Apple Notes, Google Keep, whatever you use for your note taking, and just keep a running list of some of the accomplishments
mm,
because that will, one, help you realize what did I accomplish? What experience did I gain? Because sometimes we go from unconsciously incompetent in our careers
yeah,
to unconsciously competent. We get better, but we're not quite sure what we got better at and what experience, and we discount our own knowledge and experience. Writing that down can force you to think about it.
right,
And as you write down those accomplishments, everybody tends to make this mistake. I've heard this from hiring managers is on our resumes, we will put, I was responsible for this. These
mm,
were the duties I completed. What hiring managers want to see is what things did you accomplish? What numbers did you
mm,
hit? 120% of quota,
right,
first one to initiate sale of this new product or reduce churn by this, whatever, even if you're not in sales, there are numbers that you can call out. And that regular rhythm of going back to an ongoing list of what did I accomplish will help you think about the experiences and the achievements that will
yeah.
help you be able to set you up for those conversations that you're not having yet.
Yeah, I think that's such a good idea, and it's almost like instead of making it a task or sort of a part of drudgery or routine, you could really use it as an opportunity to celebrate what you've accomplished thus far. That you're really focusing on those things, and I think you're totally right about the hiring managers. I heard from one of my mentors a while back. They said you want your resume to tell the story of where you want to go, not the story of where you've been. And I feel like that really connects to sharing accomplishments and giving them a picture of what you're capable of moving forward. So as we're connecting these dots, like what was it about the skills as a journalist that you feel like really prepared you for a more successful, like the specific skills that prepared you for that successful career in sales?
Yeah, I would say it has been something I've used in sales, and now I'm trying to translate that even to marketing as well as I'm making this most recent shift. And I think one of the top ones is networking and realizing that hey, we have the opportunity to form new connections, to not just wait until hey, I don't really know anybody, I really don't have a network in sales. I was really taught that hey, your net worth is directly tied to your network.
Yeah.
And so I just consistently grew my network. For me, that's been on LinkedIn, especially for, the last 5 years or so heavily. And for me, that was kind of nice because I always hated kind of the local networking things, the Chamber of Commerce meetings and
Yeah.
those sort of meetups. I just always felt like it was a little bit awkward. And so I leaned really heavily into building my network on LinkedIn, not just kind of growing connections and followers, but when I saw there was something there, hey, let's hop on Zoom for 30 minutes. Let's connect here and there might not be anything of where I can help you or you can help me or you hire me or anything like that. But taking those times to intentionally build that network it's kind of the same advice as the resume, right? When
Yeah.
you have to update your resume, man, that feels like a chore and, oh, I got to scramble. How do I put this together? Well, also, oh, I gotta tap my network because I need some help. Well, I haven't spent the last 3 years when I didn't need my network building and investing in my network. And so, from a journalist standpoint, like you grow your network by just going out, asking people, forming new connections, also building relationships with people who might be your sources or who might, influence things down the road, even if there's not something right there. I think the second thing that really helped me in my sales career and has helped me as a content creator and a marketer as well is asking questions, continuing to ask questions beyond the standard things. Ask those open-ended questions, be comfortable with silence and let people keep talking, and then ask that follow-up question. I can see some of it in the way that you host this show. You summarize and try and call out one of the things that someone said and then have them elaborate on it. We have a lot more leeway to ask quote unquote dumb questions or to press for a little bit more if we're willing to kind of step out there. And so I think now one of the other things I've done in my career that I would highly suggest anyone do, especially if maybe you struggle with networking, you struggle with asking people for advice or, asking those questions, start a podcast. It has been one of the greatest ways for me to build my network, to learn for free, to get guidance, counseling, career development at no cost from people I probably otherwise wouldn't have access to, because I'm inviting them to share their knowledge with not just me, but anyone who might listen. And you don't have to have a large audience to get people to say, yes, I'll create some content with you.
Very true. I have learned so much through podcasting, and it was really just I wanted to see if I could do it. It was a challenge, Let's see if mess around and find out, kind of. And I think you're so right. It's given me access to people that I never would have had access to. Namely, I mean, you right here. Like that's a great example. But I think the other thing about podcasting that's so exciting is everybody. What I'm realizing is everybody has a story, and whether or not I've had a LinkedIn influencer, someone akin to you, or someone who's just a closer friend, or a colleague that I think has a unique perspective, every person has a bit of valuable information to share, to really further the conversation of how to grow your career, further the conversation of how to grow yourself. And I think it challenges you to understand how to, at least when I'm doing it live, it challenges me how to understand how to think on my feet. So all of those things are things that I've learned from podcasting. And I will say to people, it's a lot easier than you think it is. I mean, it
Mhm.
feels really complex, but if you start bootstrapping it, it's a lot easier than you think it is. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So how does sort of the history of what you've done in the past, maybe even pre-journalism, like just how does that make you a better salesperson?
Hmm. Interesting. Um, Trying to think of things in the past. I mean, I think that one of the things that I really leaned into, especially when I was selling for Sweetfish, was um, that I did hone my writing skills. So I talked a little bit
Mm.
about interviewing skills, networking, those sorts of things. Anymore, there are some industries where outbound cold calling still works pretty effectively. There are others where that's just not the case. And so, if you can't write and communicate asynchronously well via email, via creating content on LinkedIn, via sharing something in LinkedIn DMs that will actually intrigue someone to take a meeting with you. If you say, "Hey, I'm a great seller because if I could just get people on the phone, I can work some magic." Well, there's some work that has to be done before you're able to get people on the phone these days. I was talking with a friend of mine, Jared Fuller, who co-founded Partner Hacker with his partner Isaac, and they're now at Reveal after they merged with them. And he said, "This point in my career, one of the skills that I've honed is writing introduction emails for other people to send on my behalf." So if,
Oh,
like, Britta, I see someone you're connected with and I'm like, I really, I think I could help this person, instead of me going cold to them and saying, "Hey, let me try and intrigue them to take a meeting. What if I asked you for that introduction again, because we've built a relationship and I've invested in that network, going back to what we were talking about before? What
Mhm.
if I could craft something that to put in your hands to send to that person to make it easy for you to make that introduction? So these writing skills and your communication skills, not only verbally, on video, or in person and on the phone, are really paramount. And so I would say, work on your writing skills, because that, for me, going from journalism and also just kind of naturally leaning into that even before I got into journalism, has helped me as a salesperson. And I would say now that I'm connecting even more dots to go with the theme of today's show, because it is harder to break into people to get those introductions, those writing skills, for the example that I just shared as one example, makes it even more important these days, I think.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think writing an introduction email in general is a difficult one. I don't know about what your strategy is, but I think this is an interesting point to touch on. Usually, when I write an introduction email, I'll say, blank meet blank. They are, and then I'll say like three things that this person I know is good at, or three things that this person is known for, and then I do the same with the other person, and then I think. It's hard to know how to properly introduce people, but how do you this is maybe just a touch off topic, but if you're doing an introduction, how do you usually do that? How do you like to do that?
Similar to what you just said there, Britta, giving people more than just, hey, name and name, right? I think a tactical thing you can do these days is make sure you link to both people's LinkedIn profiles so that they can click through, get a sense, gives them, a face with the name, because maybe your face is in your email signature, but they've never seen this person's face. That's
Right.
just going to help those two people form that connection a little bit more quickly. So a tactical thing I would say there, and then listing things on both sides, but listing what you think is going to be applicable. Now, in certain situations, you might be able to list more or whatever, but as opposed to saying, hey, Britta, and this is her role, and this is her podcast, and this and that, what prompted the introduction? I
Right.
was talking with Britta about X, and it made me think of you. And I think even that phrasing of it made me think of you makes it make more sense for the other person, and
Yeah.
it flatters them a little bit. Wait, you were talking with this person and you thought of me? So one, you're investing in that network saying, hey, I'm trying to add value to you, and two, it makes that message come across as more relevant. So I would say start with that structure you just talked about there, and there are a few little nuances you could layer on.
Yeah.
And I think together, I think we just came up with a really good framework for an intro
We,
email.
let's build a course, man. So has I just kind of to cover most of what we've talked about, I just really want to ask, it has it been worth it? Like, what have been the struggles or struggle that you didn't really anticipate when you pivoted, and has it been worth it?
Yeah, I would say, to me, it definitely has been worth it, because early in my career, you don't, like we were talking about, 2 years, and that's kind of a benchmark people talk about, and being able to press through in your sales career, and that just felt like forever. Felt
Right.
like forever. Now I look at, being in the workforce for about 15 years. Us millennials are no longer just coming out of college. Don't confuse the millennials with the Gen Z folks. No
True.
shade on Gen Z. I
Yeah.
love my Gen Z coworkers, but um, I just, you don't really realize, like, 2 years really isn't a lot in the span of things, right? You hear Gary Vee talk about, oh, you're 50 and you're talking about like winding down. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
I look at the same sort of thing being in my, mid to late 30s now, and approaching 40. So I think that for anybody who's earlier in their career listening to this, um, you know, you've got a little bit different perspective on time once you've been in the workforce for a bit. And if you're looking at something of, oh, I think this could help me get to where I'm going, but man, it feels slow, it feels like I'm going to have to do, a year doing this or whatever. um, I think just knowing that, hey, there is some, I don't think we're in the same environment where, like it used to be, you got to pay your dues. Like, this is exactly how, like, you work your way up the corporate ladder. But there are some things in making paying your dues worth it if you're doing like what we're talking about here. You're recognizing what you're accomplishing, what experiences, and where you want to go as you're going through that thing of, okay, this isn't really where I want to be, but how can I make this worth it? So it's a little bit rambling, but trying to be encouraging to folks there, um, because that to me, um, has been something I thought about a little bit more as I reached kind of the next stage in my career. And I would say the second thing that is maybe a bit of a struggle is I don't think that in the current environment, oh, I made this pivot and now I'm done,
Right.
right? You may make this pivot and AI may completely change or eliminate the job that you're wanting or the one that you're in right now. And so things are going to continue to evolve and change more quickly. So I would say the other encouragement is, you know, don't view pivoting as like, oh my gosh, it's this big thing. If you look at, hey, I'm always open to pivoting, to shifting, both because of what options are in the market, but the good side of that coin is we have more options now than we ever had to shift and pivot. Sorry, backwards there. To shift and pivot in our career than our parents and our grandparents did. And so while we get kind of the bad side of the coin of needing to deal with more volatility and change in some ways based on where the world is today, we also have more options and opportunity. Like you can
Yes.
start a business and spend $89 on LegalZoom to form an LLC and go start selling something and spin up a free card website and sell something that you have an idea on in like 24 hours.
Yeah.
That was not the case, a generation ago, or even all that long ago. So that's what I would say as I look back and try to be a little bit reflective on where I'm at.
Yeah, I think you're so right that pivoting and shifting, there's so much more opportunity now. And I think, at least for me, if I've geared my career development towards gaining new skills and always looking to gain that next skill, it makes pivoting much easier. So, like you said, really capitalizing on some of these like market shifts and not looking at like a pivot as like this big scary thing, but there's an opportunity here. And what is that opportunity? So, what would you tell someone who's considering getting into sales but is afraid or is unsure? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, one thing you can do is there are a plethora of sales podcasts out there, YouTube channels, those sorts of things. If you're looking at B2B sales, if you're looking at SaaS, listen to some of those podcasts. Find some of the folks, maybe they're not the huge names, but like, hey, you've heard them on a podcast and they've been a successful enterprise AE for 5 years, or they've been a director of sales and they've worked their way up in their career. Check out some of those podcasts and reach out to some of those people on LinkedIn. Ask them a few specific questions. See if you could, get them to let you pick their brain a little bit. Work that networking muscle, and I think you'll find that, hey, you could find some opportunities, or you could find a leg up of what is this going to be like, and if I decide to pursue it, how could I be successful if you take advantage of what's out there today. Again, going back, 10, 20 years, we didn't have the same options to try and figure out what's it going to be like if I'm in this industry or if I'm in this role or if I'm in this type of work. We just had to kind of roll the dice and try it and then show up on day one. So much more is out there and accessible. So leaning into content and podcasting, as we were talking about earlier, and networking, I think can give you a leg up, and two, can give you insights into, is this something that I really want to try before you actually did it?
Yeah, I think that's such a great idea, is really listening to the people that have come before you, hearing what their experience is. And I think also, just beyond that, I would encourage anyone that sales isn't really this like big crazy thing. It's more like developing relationships. Maybe back in Glengarry, Glen Ross times, it was scarier, but it's really just developing good relationships and being good to the people that you develop relationships with. So we're nearing the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining me. But like to end with our two rapid fire questions. So the first question is, what is the most random job that you have ever had?
This goes all the way back to my childhood. I cleaned stalls for my parents and grandparents as they trained racehorses
Oh my.
when I was growing up. Did not realize that the family business being in the racehorse industry was so novel. But now looking back and connecting the dots, I'm like, most people, don't have any idea of that. And so watering the horses, feeding the horses, cleaning stalls, those sorts of things were quite kind of my first quote unquote summer job, if you will.
That sounds so cool. That sounds like such a fun summer job. Maybe not the scooping the smelly stuff, but so the last rapid fire question is, what is the worst career advice that you have ever gotten?
Fake it till you make it.
Oh, good one. Say more.
I think that, especially if you're out there networking on LinkedIn, you're on social channels, it can be very tempting, to put up this front, to try and show where you want to go and say that you're there already. But I've found that I get a lot more support. I get more empathy. I get people cheering me on, saying, "Hey, look, I'm learning out loud." I'm literally in the midst of a transition now from sales into marketing and trying to translate some of my sales skills into a marketing role. And as I've been sharing things, I'm like, I think this is how I could connect the dots.
Yeah,
But as I share on LinkedIn, I've figured this out. I think this worked for me. Could this work more broadly? Oh no, maybe not. Maybe it would need to be tweaked. It was something I heard. This was kind of related to content more than selling or just personal brand. But Alex Hermosi is a great one if you're entrepreneurial minded, following his content. And he said, if you're sharing stuff online, there's a big difference between, Britta, you should eat oatmeal for breakfast every day because it has these 5 benefits,
yeah,
versus, hey, I eat oatmeal for breakfast every day and it's giving me these benefits. I think maybe you should try it too.
yeah,
And that to me is a small example, and it's more content related. But whether it's one to one or it's out there somewhat publicly on social channels, share, there is opportunity to share really where you're at without this. I think is the antithesis to fake it till you make it, which I've heard before from even people I know, like, and trust that have shared that career advice.
yeah, yeah. I think that's such an interesting mindset shift in that way, and I liked what you pointed out about the shift in voice from "you should do this XYZ thing" to "here are the benefits. This is what I've done." I think there's been so many times I've written a LinkedIn post and realized I was saying you a lot, and kind of saying that sort of having that should mindset, and then I would go through and revise and put I, and then then I would start to tweak it and realize, you know what, this is really just about what my experience is. This might not work for somebody else, and usually I get much more engagement on when I'm just honest about where I'm at. So I appreciate
Mm.
that authenticity. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I want to thank everyone else who joined us. I wasn't able to really access the chat, so I hope that you guys enjoyed chatting in the chat. Thank you so much for your engagement. If you want to listen to this episode again, it goes live on all relevant podcasting channels on Monday. Don't forget to subscribe to the channels and like and share with other friends that you think would benefit from this information. And join me next week live at 8:30 a.m., hopefully, if there's no technical difficulties, on the Newly podcast, where you will get practical, no BS insights on how to grow yourself and grow your career. See you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Britta.